My name is Delia Hartwell, and I am 31 years old. And the morning my mother told me I was born to carry this family, I had already been doing it for 11 years. I want to be precise about that number. 11 years. Not a vague stretch of time that I have softened into a general feeling of obligation. 11 specific years, which started when I was 20 and our father left and my mother sat down at the kitchen table and looked at me, not at my sister Renata, who is 17 and still in high school, but at me and said, "I don't know how we're going to manage." And I said, "Don't worry, I'll figure it out." And then I went and figured it out and I never quite stopped. The house was the yellow one on Callaway Street in Greenfield. 2-bedroom, aluminum siding, a kitchen window that faced the backyard, and the big silver maple that dropped its pods on the porch every October. I had grown up in that house. I knew every creak in the hallway floor, every way the back door swelled in July, every spot in the kitchen where the linoleum had lifted at the corner and you had to step around it. I knew the house the way, something you have tended for a long time. Not with joy, exactly. With familiarity. With the specific quiet knowledge that comes from being the one who fixes things. The arrangement, when I was 20, had seemed temporary. I told myself it was temporary. I moved back into my old bedroom, the small one off the kitchen with a single window that looked at the fence, and I got a second waitressing shift, and I started paying the gas and electric. My mother's teaching salary covered the mortgage, but there was never anything left after that. So I covered the utilities and I covered the groceries when she ran short, and I drove Renata to school because my mother had 2 evening classes that semester and couldn't manage the pickup times. Temporary lasted 11 years. I want to be fair to my mother because I think being fair is important even when fairness costs you something. My mother, Paula Hartwell, was not a cruel woman by design. She grew up in a house where one child was the capable one and the other children were given different expectations, and she absorbed that arrangement the way children absorb everything, not by thinking about it, but by breathing it in until it became the shape of normal. Her own mother had done the same thing to her sister Ruth, who had driven every relative to every appointment for 40 years and died with a back so bad she couldn't stand long enough to make a cup of tea. My mother watched that happen and she still couldn't see the pattern when it transferred to her own daughters. That's not an excuse. It's just how I understand it now, from a distance. She wasn't being strategic. She was being what she had learned to be. Renata was the one who was delicate. That was the word my mother used, always with a soft voice, always with a kind of tenderness that I never heard directed at me. Renata had anxiety. Renata had trouble with early mornings. Renata had a hard time holding jobs because her anxiety made workplace stress difficult. These things were true. I am not dismissing them. But what I noticed, even then, was that Renata's difficulty always translated into my labor. When Renata couldn't pay her phone bill, I covered it. When Renata had a bad month and couldn't make rent, I lent her money that was never discussed as a loan and never repaid. When Renata needed a ride to her therapist at 7:15 in the morning, I got up at 6:30, even when I had a double shift starting at 9. I kept a ledger, a small green spiral notebook in my kitchen drawer that I started in 2019 when the amounts got large enough to worry me, not to confront anyone with. I wasn't planning a confrontation. I just needed to know the number. The actual number. Because I had the feeling, the way you sometimes have a feeling you can't name until you make it concrete, that the number was significant. The last tally I made before everything changed was $48,214. Over 7 years. Not counting the non-cash labor, the hours driving and cooking and managing appointments and answering 11 p.m. calls when my mother couldn't sleep. I had a life alongside all of this. I want to make that clear too. I was not a person defined entirely by what I gave away. I had my own apartment across town on Birchwood Avenue, a 2-room place I paid for myself, with a small balcony that faced east and caught the morning light. I had a job I was genuinely good at. I managed scheduling and operations for a mid-sized pediatric clinic, and I was careful and organized and the kind of employee who notices things before they become problems. I had a friend named Willa, who had known me since we were 12, and who had been watching my family situation for years with the expression of someone watching a car drive very slowly toward a guardrail. I had been seeing a therapist, Dr. Anine, since 2021. She was the one who first said the word parentification to me. I didn't love the word. It felt clinical in a way that didn't capture the texture of it, the specific weight of growing up being someone's solution before you were old enough to have your own problems. But Dr. Annine wasn't interested in words I loved. She was interested in what was actually happening. What was actually happening, she said, in our session on the second Tuesday of March, was that I had never been given permission to leave. Not explicitly forbidden. Just never given permission. There's a difference, she said, between a locked door and a door you've been standing in front of so long you stopped checking whether it opens. What would it look like, she said, if you stopped? I thought about that for a long time after I left her office. I sat in my Honda Civic in the parking lot of the building on Denison Street for 38 minutes without turning the key. The sun was going down behind the pharmacy across the street, and the light was that particular flat gray of late winter, and I sat there and tried to picture what it would look like if I stopped. Not gradually. Not with a conversation first. Just stopped. Didn't answer. Didn't transfer. Didn't drive to Callaway on a Saturday with the trunk of my car ready to absorb whatever needed absorbing. I could not picture it. The image wouldn't form. It kept sliding away from me, the way images do when you've been told, implicitly and for years, that the picture doesn't apply to you. What I pictured instead was my mother's face when the phone went unanswered, and then Renata's. And then the specific guilt that I had been managing since I was 20 years old rose up in my chest the way it always did, and I understood then, sitting in that parking lot in the flat gray light, that the guilt was not mine. I had borrowed it. I had been handed it so young that I had assumed it was native to me, like my eye color or the way I run slightly cold in winter. But it wasn't. It was someone else's guilt, passed to me because I was the one who would hold it. I turned the key and drove home, and I didn't talk to my mother for 4 days, which was unusual. She called on day 2 and left a message that said she'd been trying to reach me about Renata's car insurance renewal. I listened to the message twice. I did not call back. I sat with the space that the not calling back created. It was uncomfortable in a way I hadn't expected, not because I felt wrong, but because I felt so unfamiliar with the absence of the obligation. My Tuesday evenings had been structured around being available. My Saturday mornings had been structured around the expectation that I would answer if Callaway called. The 4 days of silence felt like a room I had cleared the furniture out of and was standing in, trying to figure out what I actually wanted in it. 2 weeks after that session with Dr. Annine, my mother called on a Wednesday morning at 6:32 and asked if I could come to the house on Saturday. Renata was coming too. There was some paperwork about re-adding me to the homeowner's insurance, something had lapsed, and she wanted us both there. I said I'd come. I arrived at the yellow house on Callaway Street at 11 a.m. on a Saturday at the end of March. The silver maple was starting to bud. Renata was already there. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her hands around a mug, and she looked up when I came in and gave me the small smile she always gave me, the smile of someone who knows she is loved and has never examined the cost of that knowledge. My mother made coffee. She found the insurance papers. We sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where I had been sitting at since I was 8 years old, the one with the nick in the corner from the time Renata and I tried to move it ourselves when we were teenagers. We dealt with the insurance in about 20 minutes. My mother put the papers back in the folder. Then she poured herself more coffee and sat down, and she looked at me with the expression she had when she was about to say something she thought was loving. "I've been thinking," she said, "about the situation with Renata's car." Renata's car had needed a new alternator. The cost was $847. I already knew where this was going before she said another word. "Her account is overdrawn this month," my mother said. "I was thinking, since you're doing well, if you could cover it just until she gets back on her feet." "She's been off her feet for 11 years, I said. I said it quietly. I wasn't angry, exactly. I was just tired, and tired had started sounding, that morning, like something close to honest. My mother looked at me. She tilted her head slightly, the way she did when she was recalibrating. "You've always been the stronger one," she said. "You know that. Renata doesn't have your patience. You've always had the capacity," she continued, and her voice was warm, the way it was when she believed she was saying something kind. "You were born to carry this family, Delia. Some people are just built that way." I looked at her. Renata looked at her coffee. I looked at the porcelain bowl on the counter near the door where I had dropped my keys when I came in. The bowl was cream-colored with a small blue leaf pattern around the rim. It had been there since I was a child. I had dropped my keys in it 1,000 times. I did not argue. I did not explain. I did not give them the scene they would have been able to file away as proof that I was reactive, that I was difficult, that I had overreacted to something that was meant lovingly. I stood up. I picked up my keys from the porcelain bowl. I looked at my mother for a moment. She was still talking, something about responsibility and family being a team, and I set my keys back down on the counter beside the bowl, not inside it, because I wasn't coming back for them. I picked up my coat from the chair. I walked to the front door. I walked out. The door closed behind me with the soft click of a door that fits its frame well, and I stood on the porch for exactly 4 seconds, and then I walked to my Honda Civic at the curb, and I got in and I drove away. I didn't cry until I was on the interstate. The exit ramp for Callaway was behind me and the road opened up, and I had the specific sensation I have heard other people describe, but never quite believed until that moment, of something loosening in my chest. Not relief, exactly. Something quieter than relief. Something that had been holding a shape for so long, it didn't know at first how to release. I cried for about 12 minutes. Then I stopped because there was a car behind me going too slowly, and I had to focus, and that seemed right. That seemed like the correct way for this particular chapter to end. 12 minutes of driving and crying on Route 9, and then back to the road, and back to the task of being where I was going. I had already, over the previous 6 weeks, been doing certain things. This matters, and I want to be clear about it, because I am not someone who acts on impulse. I act on long, slow certainty. The certainty had been building since that 38 minutes in the parking lot on Denison Street, and by the time I walked out of the house on Callaway, the quiet work was mostly done. 6 weeks earlier, I had called my landlord and renewed my lease on Birchwood Avenue for another year, which I had been putting off because some part of me had assumed, vaguely, that I might eventually move back to Callaway to manage things more directly. I stopped assuming that. 5 weeks earlier, I had called the bank and removed my mother as a secondary contact on my account. Not a malicious act, just a housekeeping one. She had been added during a medical procedure I had in 2020, and I had never removed her. 3 weeks earlier, I had called Willa and told her what I was thinking. Willa, to her credit, did not say, finally. She said, "Okay, what do you need?" I said I needed someone to know what I was doing in case I lost my nerve. She said she would keep me honest. She has been keeping me honest about things for 19 years, and she is very good at it. And the week before the Saturday at Callaway, I had gone to see Dr. Annine and told her I thought I was almost ready to do what she had been gently asking me to picture. She asked what ready felt like. I said it felt like being tired enough that the fear was smaller than the exhaustion. She said that was usually when it happened. The night of the Saturday, I left the keys on the counter. I sat on my balcony on Birchwood Avenue with the Earl Grey tea tin from the cabinet, and I made a cup of tea, and I sat in the dark with it until it went cold. The maple on the street below was budding. The night was quiet. I thought about my mother sitting at the kitchen table in the house on Callaway. I thought about Renata still holding her coffee mug. I thought about the porcelain bowl on the counter, and the way the keys looked sitting there without my hand on them. I did not call anyone. I did not text anyone. I let the night be what it was. I want to tell you honestly that I was not entirely calm. The quiet that I was managing inside myself was not the same as peace. It was more like the stillness you maintain when you are carrying something heavy and you are focusing all your energy on the carrying and not on what it costs. I thought, sitting there, maybe she will understand. Maybe when she calls tomorrow and I don't answer, she will sit with it long enough to understand. I thought, maybe she won't. I thought, it is no longer my job to manage which one she chooses. That thought was new. I held it carefully, the way you hold something that is both fragile and true. She called the next morning at 9:14. I watched my phone on the kitchen counter. I did not pick it up. She called again at 10:02. I was in the shower. There was a voicemail. I listened to it at noon. It said, "Delia, I don't know what happened yesterday. You left without saying anything and you left your keys, and I don't understand. Please call me back." She was not angry in the voicemail. She was confused. There is a particular kind of confusion that happens when a system loses a piece it depended on without understanding that it depended on it. She didn't know yet that the keys were the message. I did not call back. I texted, "I'm okay. I need some time." She called 4 more times that day. I did not pick up. The calls continued for 3 weeks. I kept a count because I am the kind of person who keeps counts. By the end of week 3, 47 calls from my mother, 11 from Renata, and 2 from my Aunt Patricia in Brattleboro, who had apparently been recruited as an intermediary. I spoke to Aunt Patricia. I had always liked Aunt Patricia. She was my father's sister and had stayed in our lives out of some stubborn loyalty that had outlasted the marriage. She called on a Tuesday at 7 p.m., and I picked up because I thought she deserved to hear my voice. "Your mother is scared," Aunt Patricia said. "I know," I said. "She doesn't understand why you left." "I know that too. Can you explain it to her?" I thought about that for a moment. Outside my window, the maple was fully in leaf now, the early April green that looks almost too bright to be real. "I left my keys on her counter," I said. "I think that's the explanation." Aunt Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She called me crying last night. She said she doesn't know what she did wrong." "I believe her," I said. "That's the hard part, Patricia. I really believe she doesn't know." We talked for another 20 minutes. Aunt Patricia did not try to talk me into calling my mother. She is 71 years old and has watched a lot of family patterns long enough to recognize when one has finally reached its end. Before she hung up, she said, "You sound different." I asked her what she meant. She said, "Lighter, like you put something down." I had. Renata's message in the second week was harder to sit with than my mother's. "That's the truth," Renata said. "I don't know what Mom did, but I know you're mad, and I just want to say that I love you, and I'm sorry if I've made things hard." And then she cried a little at the end of the message, and I sat with my phone in my hand for a long time. The thing about Renata is that she was also a victim of the arrangement. She hadn't designed it either. She had been raised inside the same family mythology that taught me to carry and taught her to receive, and neither of us had chosen the roles we were handed. My mother had decided, when we were children, that Renata's temperament required protection and mine required deployment, and we had both grown up shaped by those decisions like trees that have grown around a fence. Renata's guilt, when she finally felt it, was real. I believed that. But belief is not the same as access. Compassion is not a door key. And I needed, at least for a while, to let the silence be the only message, because every time I had tried to use words in the past, every time I had gently said, "I'm stretched thin," or "I can't this month," the words had been absorbed and then quietly ignored, and the next ask had come anyway. Words in my family had been a way of expressing discomfort that could then be soothed and set aside. Silence was a different language. It had weight. It could not be patted on the shoulder and redirected. So I let the silence stand. Willa came over in week 2 with takeout from the Thai place on Elm, and we sat at my kitchen table, and she didn't ask me if I was sure. She already knew I was sure. Instead, she asked me how I was sleeping, and I told her better than I had in years. Not perfectly, not without the occasional 3 a.m. inventory of everything I might be doing wrong, but better. "You know they're going to come around eventually," she said, with some version of an apology. "Maybe," I said. "What are you going to do when they do?" I thought about that. I poured more water. The copper kettle on my stove was still warm from the tea I'd made before she arrived. "I don't know yet," I said. "I think I'm going to figure it out when it gets here. I've been planning ahead for so long. I think I'd like to try just living in the week I'm actually in." Willa looked at me with the expression she has had since we were 12, the one that says she sees me very clearly and is deciding whether to say the whole thing or just part of it. She said the part. That sounds like a very sane thing to say. The whole thing, I think, was, "It's about time." At the end of week 3, my mother stopped calling daily. The calls dropped to every other day, then twice a week. The voicemails shifted in register, from confused to quiet, from quiet to something that sounded, for the first time, like self-examination. The last voicemail I received in April said, "I've been thinking about what you said, about being the stronger one. I've been sitting with it. I don't think I realized. I played that message 3 times. Meanwhile, my own life was doing something I had not quite anticipated. It was expanding. Not dramatically, not in a way that looked like anything from the outside. But the Saturdays I had previously spent on Callaway I was now spending on my own terms, and the specific texture of a Saturday morning that belonged entirely to me was something I was only beginning to understand. I walked to the farmer's market on Elm. I read in the afternoon, without checking my phone. I took a pottery class on Saturday mornings at the community center on Grove Street, which I had been meaning to do for 3 years and had always found a reason to postpone. The pottery class was taught by a woman named Margot who was 63 and had the calm, deliberate manner of someone who had made peace with slowness. She never told me I was good. She told me I was improving, which is the more honest and more useful thing to say. I showed up every Saturday at 9 and put my hands in the clay and did not think about Callaway once in those 2 hours, and that felt like something significant. That felt like proof that there was a self here that had been waiting, patient and specific, for the room to exist. It does not fix anything, one pottery class. I know that. But small things, done on your own terms, have a compound effect. They remind you that you have preferences. They remind you that your Saturday morning is a thing of value, and that how you spend it is a choice that belongs to you. The voicemail from my mother in late April did not fix anything either. I want to be honest about that. A voicemail is not amends, and awareness is not the same as change, and I had been given small gestures before that dissolved back into the same pattern by the following week. A message in April was not a reason to go back to the yellow house and the porcelain bowl and the same table and the same cups. But it was something. It was the beginning of a different kind of conversation. One that, for the first time, I was not going to have on their terms. I want to tell you about the morning in May that I understood fully what I had done. It was a Tuesday early before work. I was on my balcony with the Earl Grey tin, and the morning was cool, and the maple below was completely in leaf, and the light was coming in at the angle that only happens in May, low and golden and longer than you expect. I had a call with Dr. Anine at noon. I had a full day at the clinic after that. I had dinner plans with Willow on Thursday. I had, for the first time in 11 years, a week that was entirely mine. No call to manage. No transfer to remember. No 6:32 a.m. request I was going to have to navigate around before I had even finished my coffee. No calculation running quietly in the background of every decision I made about money, about time, about what I could afford to give. Just the morning. Just the maple. Just the tea going warm in my hands. Some kindnesses are loans the lender forgets they're keeping. I had been a loan my family forgot they were borrowing. And I had finally, quietly, without announcement, without the scene they would have called dramatic, called it in. Not for repayment. That's not the right word. I called in the loan by stopping the lending. That was all. That was the whole thing. I set the keys down and I walked out, and I did not perform my exit for an audience, and I did not need them to understand it in the moment, and I did not wait for permission. A month after I left, a small thing happened that I keep returning to. My mother sent a card. A real card, paper through the mail. She is not a card-sending person. The last card I could remember receiving from her was a birthday card when I turned 26 that had a printed verse inside, and her signature, and nothing else. No personal line, no addition, just the signature, the way you sign something you are completing rather than beginning. The fact of a card in the mailbox was startling before I even opened it. I stood at the mailbox for a moment with the envelope in my hand, looking at her handwriting on the front. She had used a real pen. Blue ink, slightly uneven, the handwriting of someone who doesn't write by hand very often anymore. Inside she had written, "I've been thinking about the kitchen table. I think I have been sitting at it my whole life, expecting certain people to refill everything. I don't know when I learned that was all right. I don't know if you'll want to talk to me. I hope eventually you will. I am not going to push." It was 7 sentences. My mother, who could talk for 45 minutes about Renata's parking situation, had written 7 sentences and then stopped. That restraint cost her something. I know her well enough to know that. I put the card on my counter beside the Earl Grey tin. I haven't thrown it away. I haven't called either. I am living in the week I am actually in, and this week I am not ready, and I am not going to manufacture readiness to manage someone else's discomfort. but I read the card sometimes. And I think, maybe. I said at the beginning that I want to be precise, so let me be precise about this too. Leaving is not the same as being driven out. Leaving is a decision, and decisions have weight that surrender does not. I did not slam a door. I did not make a speech. I did not write a letter listing every grievance in order of severity. I set down a set of keys and I walked to my car, and that was the fullest, most complete sentence I had ever said to my family. There is a difference between love and management. I understand now that what my family had been offering me was a version of love that required me to remain small enough to be useful. And I had accepted that version for a long time because it was the only version on offer, and because some love, even diminished love, feels better than nothing when you are 20 years old and your father has just left and someone needs you. But I am not 20 anymore. Roles can be recast. The first person who needs to know you are done shrinking is you. I knew it on a Tuesday in a parking lot in winter, sitting for 38 minutes without turning the key. And then I spent 6 weeks making quiet preparations, and then I sat at a kitchen table while my mother told me I was born for this, and I stood up. There is something I have been thinking about since, and I want to leave it with you because I think it might be useful to someone who needs it. Family without respect becomes entitlement, and entitlement grows teeth the moment you build something it cannot control. My family did not understand that I had been building something. They saw the labor I gave them and assumed it was renewable. They never looked behind it to see what I was building with what was left: the apartment, the clinic job, the mornings on the balcony, the life that was quietly taking shape in the hours they didn't ask me to fill. I built it in the margins. That's where people like us build things at first, in the margins, in the hours before the calls start, in the weekends we don't report back on. And then one day the thing you've been building in the margins is larger than the obligation, and you have to decide which one you're going to live in. I chose the thing I built. Forgiveness is not access. Understanding is not reunion. I am not closing the door forever. I am closing it for now, and holding the handle, and deciding, for the first time in 11 years, whether to open it and when and how far. That is not cruelty. That is the beginning of a life that actually belongs to me. If there is someone in your life, maybe a parent, maybe a sibling, maybe the whole architecture of your family of origin, who has decided without ever asking that you are the one who carries things, I want to ask you something. Not because I have the answer. Because I asked it of myself in a parking lot in February, and it changed everything. When did you decide that carrying them was the same thing as belonging to them? And what would it look like, the morning after you set the keys down, to find out you were wrong?